So just a few days ago, the second phase of the DLC rework came out and it was pretty interesting. For me at least, I think they've done a lot of good with this update, but they've also done some things I'm not a big fan of. But to start off, I want to talk about the bug fixes. The two most notable ones for me are eccentric face no longer being useless if you pick up a bolstering lantern. That was very annoying to deal with, so I'm glad it got fixed. I can already hear the speedrunners going absolutely crazy. And the other notable fix is Newt finally has his voice back. Nice. Now let's get into the item reworks. I think they've been done pretty tastefully and it looks obvious they've taken community feedback into account. Unstable Transmitter is no longer God incarnate, but is instead a reusable power elixir that refreshes each stage. At first, I was kinda sad, kinda iffy that they nerfed it by not only removing the one-shot protection, but also making it a once per stage use. But now that I really think about it, that's pretty in line with the other green items. I'd say that's a good change overall. For a couple other items, you've got some numbers being toned down, which I think is fair, especially on Growth Nectar. Growth Nectar is still a very good item, it's still better than an Irradiant Pearl, but you're no longer getting over plus 100% stats with only 2 stacks of it. For War Bonds, the proc coefficient was completely removed, which I think is 100% fair. Again, it's still very good. You have percentage-based damage, which could be multiplied by other sources, but it's no longer going to activate a missile and wipe the boss out instantly. Another good change is the base speed no longer being on the elusive antlers. You have to pick up the orbs for speed now. So now it's pretty much on par with a hoof, instead of being 3 times better on the first pickup. Yeah, I'd say I'm a pretty big fan of all the item changes. The only one I don't really like is the Sonorous Whispers. I do understand the logic behind it though. There's more green items than there are white in the game, so to balance it out, they increase the odds of a white dropping by a little bit. Again, it's understandable. It's just, it was already kind of fine where it was at balance-wise, and I don't really see the need for another nerf. But once again, just want to reiterate, big fan of all the other item reworks. Now let's talk about the False Sun boss fight rework. The changes made to this fight were the main highlight of this update. In fact, this is what the entirety of Phase 2 on the roadmap was named after. Attacks were reworked, animations were changed, gimmicks were reworked. So, with all that in mind, what do I think about the False Sun fight now? To be honest, it kinda sucks. I might get some hate for this, but I still don't really like the fight. Now, maybe you might think that's just a skill issue on my end. If that's the case, then I guess that means it's also a skill issue for the other Eclipse 8 players with thousands of hours. But me disliking the fight still is not to discredit any of the good changes that were made. The laser being from the statue now is really cool. It's also very obvious when the laser is going to come out now, so you actually have time to run behind cover. The new attacks are pretty cool and also well balanced. Big fan of those tornado things. The stone golems being limited to only 5 now is a great change. Adaptive armor, good addition. Now he doesn't just die instantly after one loop. The animations also feel more telegraphed. I can actually see what I'm getting hit by now. But my issue with the fight is that it just feels fundamentally flawed. And I say this for 2 main reasons. The first being the laser. With the way it works, the speed and damage from it forces you to stand behind a small pillar. If you deviate from it even a little bit, you're pretty much dead. That is just not good game design. Let's compare this to similar attacks from other enemies. Let's take a Stone Titan for example. When a Stone Titan lasers, you're not forced to take cover, it is simply an option. Because the speed of the laser isn't ultra fast with perfect tracking and insane damage, having enough movement speed allows you to outmaneuver it. So, for example, let's say you're hiding behind cover but get overwhelmed, and you don't have enough movement speed to continuously outmaneuver the laser. In this case, you have the choice to leave for a bit and sacrifice some of your health, moving to a safer spot. Whereas with False Sun, getting overwhelmed behind cover is pretty much a checkmate scenario. The second big issue I have with the fight is the circumstances leading up to it. If you try and fight this guy pre-loop, you pretty much have no chance. All you have to work with are 3 stages, 4 large chests, and an extra item. And although the stages in the Path of Colossus have more credits to work with, and for anyone who doesn't know what credits are, it's basically the currency used to determine how much loot can spawn in a stage. So for example, a small chest costs 15 credits, a large chest is 30. Anyways, although there's more credits per stage, it still is at least a stage and a half less than what you would have for Mythics. And also bear in mind all the possible boss items you can get kinda suck ass, except for Little Disciple on stage 3. Which means that in almost every scenario, you're definitely going to be under-equipped for the fight. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well duh, just fight him after looping then. And yeah, you could fight him after looping, but that's not the issue here. My main gripe is the fact that these Halcyon Shrines can spawn on stage 1, which means the False Sun fight is intended to be fought at any stage of the game, including pre-loop, where you most likely won't get enough items. If the boss wasn't intended to be fought pre-loop, then you shouldn't give players easy direct access to him starting from the very first stage. Just look at Voidling. Now if the boss was designed to be fought pre-loop, then a lot has to change. Players will likely lack the movement or damage required to actually win pre-loop. Okay, that was a lot, but those were my two main issues with False Sun. I do have smaller gripes, like some damage numbers being too high or some attacks like his dash still feeling a little unintuitive, but ultimately I don't really mind them so much. Now before we get into the next big thing, I want to talk about some of the smaller additions. In the Bazaar, you can access the Path of Colossus by killing a couple of these small little things and accessing a green portal. That's a really cool change. But now that you can access the Path of Colossus from the Bazaar like this, I just can't help but wonder why it's still a choice in the dream portals. Look man, I just want my 2 guaranteed bans on stage 2, alright? Other changes include some enemy tweaks, Scorch Worms have less health and they no longer stay underground forever. Nice! Looks like I can finally get rid of this mod. Halcyonites now fly when spinning? Okay. Their AI was also tweaked to be a little less dumb, and their lasers also have better tracking, so all 3 of them will try to hit you now, instead of just being shot in the same spot. I think that's a fair enough change. Now for another big change. Void Fields. Oh boy. I have a bit of history with this thing. If you've seen the channel before, chances are you probably know that I did not like the timer being paused. But in this update, it looks like they decided to mess with the timer again. They've also messed with Void Fog damage and enemies getting items. Now you're probably thinking I'm happy about this, right? Let's go. Void Fields is finally balanced, right? Well, I'm a little conflicted. While I heavily agree with what they've done for the timer, I don't really like everything else they've done. Giving enemies more items for taking too long kind of goes against the spirit of Void Fields in my opinion. It's meant as a comeback factor, albeit a risky comeback factor, but a comeback factor nonetheless. But this change just further punishes the player for being underpowered. I don't like it. But I don't really mind this change so much compared to the Void Fog. Oh my god, it is fast. It is worth noting that it does ramp up slower than other sources of Void Fog, but it is still way too fast. They describe the ramp up speed as having ample time to reach event, but that's just not even true. Like, the whole point of keeping Void Fog damage in the Void Fields constant specifically was to accommodate the fact that the player has to run between vents and also spend time looting. So I'm not really sure why they even touched it, let alone make it that fast. I really hope they remove this. But on another note, it looks like the stage counter increases after entering Void Fields, so you can see all the goofy stuff shown in Disputed Origin's old video on Void Fields again. And as much as I like the stage counter going up, it was unintentional and they do plan to revert it in the future, so keep that in mind. Also, even though I said I like what they did with the timer, it's actually not working as intended. It is actually supposed to pause in between rounds when moving from cell to cell, so expect to see that changed as well. Now for the last big change, which has kind of flown under the radar, that being the complete overhaul and merging of spawn pools. If you have a keen eye, you might have noticed small things like magma worms and Xi constructs both spawning on Sky Meadows, or wisps and blind pests both spawning on Rally Point Delta. Before it was either one or the other. If you saw a blind pest on Rally Point Delta, you wouldn't see lesser wisps. But now, you'll be seeing them both. And that's because of the merging of the spawn pools. What this means is that if you have access to the DLCs, there will be a lot more variety in your runs. And this doesn't just apply to enemies, this also applies to Halcyon Shrines and Void Seeds. So, if you've been thinking they might have been showing up a bit more often, you'd have been correct. You are not going crazy. I think this is a very, very cool and healthy addition to the game that clearly had a lot of effort put behind it, so I'm not really sure why they left this out of the patch notes, but I guess it's a thing now. Dang. And with that, I believe I've covered everything. So overall, I'd give this update an 8.25 out of 10. I really like a lot of the changes they made, especially the merging of the spawn pools. Every run I have just feels that much more unique now. Although I dislike some of the choices they made, I do really like and understand the intentions behind each change. I do agree with the idea of a Void Fields nerf. I do agree with needing to make the False Sun fight more intuitive. I think the direction the dev team is trying to take is a good one, just some ideas need better execution. Well, that's gonna be it from me. Leave a comment if you agree or disagree, and if you enjoyed this video, give it a like, maybe sub. Alright, goodbye now.